Welcome to Philosophy15. I'm Scott Aiken.
I'm Robert Talese.
We're the authors of Why We Argue and How We Should, A Guide to Political Disagreement. These are 15-minute philosophy conversations between two philosophy professors, unscripted, flying without a net, man. It's going to be great. So, there's a going debate these days. It's been going for maybe about 10 years now, maybe 10
Roughly,
plus,
yeah.
about ideal and non-ideal theory. Mostly being run by the folks who are non-ideal theorists criticizing the ideal theorists. So, Rob, will you run us through what the frame of this debate is?
Well, I wish I could run you through the frame of the debate. It seems that part of what's at issue is what the issue is. That's not altogether uncommon in philosophy, but it's never a good sign, it seems to me. So let's first just to sort of constrain things more or less arbitrarily, just so that we can make some progress somewhere. So we can talk about the ideal, non-ideal theory debate as it shows up in political philosophy, as it shows up in moral philosophy, as it shows up perhaps in other areas of philosophy. So we heard a speaker in our department last week talking about non-ideal philosophy of language. Maybe there's an ideal, non-ideal distinction at work in epistemology. Who knows? Now, one of the things that I think was clear, at least to me, last week when we had somebody talking about non-ideal philosophy of language, is that whatever the ideal, non-ideal theory debate is in philosophy of language, it's structurally quite distinct from the ideal, non-ideal theory debate as it shows up in political philosophy. So let's just restrict ourselves to political philosophy. The ideal, non-ideal theory debate, even in political philosophy, though, I think is widely mischaracterized as a debate between two different modes of political philosophizing, with one side upholding one vision of political philosophy and the other side upholding an opposing vision. That's too simplistic, I think, to capture the dispute.
Okay.
Because, with maybe one exception, G.A. Cohen, there is no ideal theorist who denies that the theory of justice involves non-ideal theorizing. With the exception perhaps of G.A. Cohen, every ideal theorist in political philosophy thinks that non-ideal theory is part of what theorizing justice is. It's the non-ideal theorist that's committed to a stronger structural claim. The non-ideal theorist is committed most often to saying that there are some moderate non-idealists who I think say more sensible things than the mainstream, but the mainstream non-ideal theorist says that theorizing justice is intrinsically a non-ideal enterprise, and that ideal theories of justice are, ipso facto, distorted, distracting, ideological, a waste of time. That is, the mainstream non-ideal theorist denies that there is an ideal theoretic task as part of the task of theorizing justice at all. That's a stronger claim than what the mainstream ideal theorist claims.
Is there a super strong version that even would say that ideal theory would then be ipso facto unjust?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, got it. So that's the super strong version. Right. Something unjust about. Okay, got it.
Right, and so
unjust.
Right,
yeah.
And they do sometimes come close to saying that. They certainly say that the practitioners of ideal theory are engaged in perpetrating some kind of injustice.
Okay, got it.
That is, that by doing ideal theory, you're doing wrong, not just as a philosophical matter, but as a political matter.
Right, there's a difference between doing political philosophy wrong and then just being politically on the bad side.
Yeah.
Got it.
So it looks to me that the non-ideal theorist makes a stronger claim. That is the denial that there is any ideal theoretic component to thinking about justice. Most ideal theorists have the more modest claim that say that thinking about justice involves an ideal and a non-ideal element. What's important for the ideal theorist is the prioritization of these two elements. The ideal theorist, typically, and this is represented by Rawls and a lot of the Rawlsians, pretty much everybody but the G.A. Cohen style theorist. I don't think there are any Cohenites on this. I think there was only one Cohenite and he passed away. That was G.A. Cohen himself. The ideal theorist says that ideal theory is in analytic priority to non-ideal theory because, the line goes, non-ideal theorizing about justice is parasitic on an ideal theory. You have to find out, let's just put it very crudely, you have to figure out philosophically, as a matter of ideal theory, what a perfectly just society would be like before you can theorize justice and what ought to be done for the sake of justice or by way of implementing or furthering justice under non-ideal conditions. You first have to figure out what perfect justice looks like before you can set about the theoretical task of figuring out how to make the existing imperfect, morally questionable at best world more just. So there's a priority there. You got to get the ideal right before you could figure out what steps you can make, what steps that you could make would count as improvements in justice. The non-ideal theorist thinks that it's theorizing about improvement all the way down. Or maybe, would it be all the way up? It can't be all the way up, right? There is no up.
There's up,
right?
It's all the time.
It's just the theory of improvement, right? Without need of any conception of improvement that involves a comparison to a perfect
to perfection
state.
Right. Yeah.
So, to put it another way, the ideal theorist has a kind of Platonic premise built into the enterprise. The non-ideal theorist is anti-Platonic.
Yeah.
Right?
So let's run some of the criticisms and kind of think of a handful of the criticisms that non-ideal theorists have run. And one of them would be really a challenge to this priority thesis. And again, that is itself a Platonic kind of concept, which is that you got to have the concepts before you start recognizing cases. So the non-ideal theorist says, look, I don't have an ideal theory of justice in order to be able to recognize that racism is wrong. It looks like I don't need to have a theory about any of that stuff to be able to say, yeah, I want to have an account as to what steps we need to take to reduce the amount of racism that we see in our society. What is that? Does that land a blow? Is that the?
Well, so this is what's frustrating about the debate. If we argue, especially by way of cases,
yes.
And let me introduce a little bit of nuance that I think is sort of underlying a lot of the frustration. There's, even putting aside on the ideal theory side and not considering the G.A. Cohen view. The G.A. Cohen view is that justice is ideal. Anything less than ideal theory is not theory of justice, it's theory of administration, right? Or management or institutional design or something. It's not justice. What justice is the Platonic ideal. And the theory of justice is simply the task of figuring out what to believe about justice. It's not a theory about how to do anything. Put that view to the side. That's super strong Platonism. Let's just put it to the side. Even among the non-super strong Platonist versions of ideal theory, there is a kind of distinction that I don't think is commonly enough drawn between the ideal theory views that claim that in order to make progress on any non-ideal issue, we have to complete the task of ideal theory. That's one view.
That's one.
A more modest view, but still an ideal theoretic view, is that there's some degree of success in ideal theory that has to be achieved before we can make progress on non-ideal questions.
Right.
Now, I think that from the point of view of that weaker version of the non-G.A. Cullen Plato style ideal theory, that ideal theorist gets to say the following thing to you, Scott. Says, okay, but don't we have, before we figure out how to improve conditions on the ground vis-a-vis racism, don't we have to figure out something about the kind of bad or injury or harm racism is? What exactly is the badness-making property of racism? That's not a skeptical sort of maneuver.
Yeah.
It's to say, well, look, there are all kinds of different views about what constitutes the injustice-makingness of racism. Is it the pain? Is it the exclusion? Is it the lack of equality? Is it the domination, right? Now, it could be a combination of these things. It could be a combination of these things with some priority or salience rules. Lots of very complicated answers start emerging. But, the ideal theorist says, until we make some progress in thinking about that in which the injustice consists, it's not clear which interventions of the kind that we might be able to achieve count as improvements from the point of view of eradicating the injustice. Because if you think that, well, racism is bad because of the anguish, right? You might think, oh, here's an improvement. Do a better job at disguising it.
That's right. Or do a better job at masking it on the receiver side.
This is
something
exactly
like everyone
right.
gets Prozac or something
That's
like that.
exactly right.
Yeah.
Make people care less. Right. So, do a Brave New World kind of game. Right. So it looks like, well, no.
Don't. Come on now.
Yeah, that seems like, well, no, that's not what's bad about racism. What's bad about racism is the social exclusion, the domination, all kinds of other candidates present themselves pretty readily. You say, okay, well, don't we need ideal theorizing in order for us to help make progress on the question of the nature of racism's injustice? That's not something we find out by just kicking around in the world.
Right. So so imagine that the non-ideal theorist concedes this and says, okay, fine. It looks like there's still a little bit of preparatory work here. But now what about ought implies can? It looks like ideal theory puts the objectives of justice outside of where we're at. How does the ideal theorist respond to this sort of ought implies can objection?
Well, this is where I think the real fruit. This is where the debate is fruitful.
Okay.
On ought implies can, it's a matter of what you think a bug and what you think a feature is. Right.
Okay.
But maybe we ought to pick this up with a part 2.